Imagine adding a single tiny tax to just one specific item crossing a border. Seems simple, right? A minor adjustment in the multi-trillion-dollar flow of global trade. But what if that tiny tax wasn't tiny at all? What if it was aimed at disrupting decades of established commerce, targeting goods that are the absolute bedrock of modern industry? And what if it triggered a cascade of reactions that fundamentally reshaped global supply chains, created unexpected winners and losers, and left behind a tangled mess, still impacting the price of everything you buy? That isn't a hypothetical. It's exactly what happened starting in 2018. In a bold move to challenge the global economic order, the United States administration under President Donald Trump launched a series of tariffs, primarily targeting China, but also hitting key allies. This wasn't just a tariff here or there, it was an escalating conflict, a full-blown trade war unlike any seen in decades. And understanding this conflict isn't just about economics textbooks, it's about understanding why prices rose, why certain jobs disappeared while others briefly flickered into existence, and how the intricate global system that puts goods on shelves was pushed to a breaking point. By the end of this, you'll see how this tangled maze was built, who got lost in it, and why we're still finding our way out. So, what exactly is a tariff? At its most basic, it's a tax on imported goods or services. Think of it like a toll booth on the border. When a product crosses into a country, imposing a tariff, the importer has to pay an extra fee to the government. The idea is to make imported goods more expensive, thus making domestically produced goods relatively cheaper and more competitive. This, in theory, should encourage consumers and businesses to buy local, boosting domestic industries and employment. Tariffs have been used for centuries, sometimes as a source of government revenue, sometimes to protect nascent domestic industries. But in the modern era, particularly since the formation of the World Trade Organization, or WTO, in 1995, the global trend has been towards reducing tariffs, fostering free trade on the principle that it benefits all participating nations through efficiency and specialization. The Trump administration deliberately broke from this consensus. The stated goals of the Trump trade policy were multifaceted. One primary objective was to reduce the U.S. trade deficit, particularly with China, which was seen as unfairly benefiting from global trade rules and currency manipulation. Another goal was to address what the administration viewed as unfair trade practices by China, including intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, and state subsidies for its industries. And perhaps most politically resonant, the aim was to bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States. Tariffs were the chosen weapon to achieve these goals. The first major salvo came in early 2018, not primarily against China, but on steel and aluminum imports globally, using a rarely invoked provision of trade law, Section 232, which allows tariffs on imports deemed a threat to national security. A 25% tariff was placed on steel and 10% on aluminum. This move immediately raised eyebrows, not least because it hit close allies like Canada, Mexico, and the European Union alongside countries like China. The justification was that domestic steel and aluminum production was critical for national defense, which many saw as a stretch. But this was just the opening act. The main event was still to come, and it centered squarely on China. In July 2018, the US imposed tariffs on $34 billion worth of Chinese goods, followed swiftly by another $16 billion focusing on industrial machinery, electronics, and vehicles. China retaliated almost immediately with tariffs of equal value on US goods, targeting agricultural products like soybeans, pork, and sorghum, as well as cars and seafood. This tit-for-tat escalation continued for months, with both sides adding more and more tariffs to increasingly broad categories of goods. By the end of 2019, US tariffs covered over $360 billion worth of Chinese imports, while China had imposed tariffs on over $110 billion of US goods. This wasn't a surgical strike. It was an attempt to levy pressure across a vast swathe of the global economy. But here's where the maze truly began to form. Tariffs don't just hit the producer in the exporting country. They are paid by the importer in the country imposing the tariff. So American companies bringing goods in from China had to pay this extra tax to the US government. What did they do? They had a few options, none of them particularly easy. They could absorb the cost, eating into their profits. They could try to negotiate lower prices from their Chinese suppliers, which often proved difficult. Or they could pass the cost onto consumers by raising prices. Data and studies quickly showed that American importers and consumers bore the vast majority of the tariff costs. For example, consider a company importing bicycle parts from China. With a 25% tariff, those parts suddenly cost 25% more. The company then has to decide if they can still sell bicycles profitably. If they raise the bike's price, fewer people might buy it. If they don't raise the price, they make less money, potentially leading to layoffs or even bankruptcy. This wasn't just a hypothetical. Industries reliant on Chinese components, from electronics assembly to furniture manufacturing, felt the pinch acutely. But the tariffs had even more complex ripple effects. Take the steel and aluminum tariffs. The goal was to boost US domestic steel and aluminum production. And indeed, domestic prices initially rose, and some shuttered mills even reopened. However, this higher cost of raw materials put American manufacturers who use steel and aluminum, like car makers, appliance manufacturers, and construction companies, at a disadvantage compared to competitors in countries without those tariffs. They were effectively paying more for the same materials, increasing their production costs. So, while one small part of the industry might have seen a temporary benefit, a much larger part using those materials faced increased costs and reduced competitiveness. This highlights a key challenge of tariffs. They protect one group but often harm another further down the supply chain. The retaliatory tariffs from China had their own devastating impacts, particularly on American agriculture. China was a massive market for US agricultural products, especially soybeans. In 2017, before the trade war, the US exported over $12 billion worth of soybeans to China. When China imposed a 25% tariff on US soybeans in 2018, those exports plummeted. Farmers who had planted based on expected Chinese demand suddenly found themselves with massive surpluses and collapsing prices. The US government attempted to mitigate this with bailout packages for farmers, totaling billions of dollars, but it was cold comfort for those facing financial ruin. This demonstrates how targeted retaliation can strike at specific, politically sensitive sectors, creating pressure points within the adversary's economy. And it also shows that the cost of the trade war wasn't just borne by consumers. It was also borne by taxpayers funding these bailouts. Beyond the immediate costs and losses, the trade war injected massive uncertainty into the global economy. Businesses planning investments or sourcing strategies faced an unpredictable landscape where the cost of goods could change drastically overnight based on a tweet or a negotiating breakdown. This uncertainty is poison to long-term business planning. Companies began looking for ways to de-risk their supply chains, which were heavily concentrated in China. This led to a significant acceleration of a trend already underway: supply chain diversification. For decades, companies had optimized for cost and efficiency, building complex supply chains that often relied heavily on manufacturing in China due to lower labor costs and robust infrastructure. The tariffs, however, made simply buying from China significantly more expensive or risky. So companies began looking for alternatives. This meant shifting production or sourcing to countries like Vietnam, Mexico, India, and Thailand. But moving supply chains isn't like flipping a switch. It's incredibly complex, costly, and time-consuming. It involves finding new factories, qualifying new suppliers, renegotiating contracts, setting up new logistics and transportation routes, and dealing with different regulatory environments and labor forces. Some companies built entirely new factories in other countries. Others shifted orders to existing suppliers outside of China. This rerouting wasn't cheap. Studies estimated that the cost of restructuring supply chains due to the trade war ran into the tens of billions of dollars for American companies alone. While countries like Vietnam and Mexico saw an increase in manufacturing activity as a result of this shift, sometimes referred to as trade diversion, this wasn't necessarily a clean win. These countries often lacked the scale, infrastructure, or specialized expertise that had developed in China over decades. Bottlenecks emerged, quality control became more challenging, and costs often remained higher than they would have been pre-tariff in China. It was less about finding a better place to produce, and more about finding a less bad alternative under the new tariff structure. The stated goal of bringing manufacturing jobs back to the US also had mixed results. While some domestic industries, like steel and aluminum producers, saw a temporary boost, The job gains were often modest and sometimes offset by job losses in industries that used those materials or were hit by retaliatory tariffs. Overall employment in manufacturing saw fluctuations driven by many factors, but the trade war did not trigger a large-scale, sustained boom in American factory jobs. The complexity of modern manufacturing means that simply taxing imports isn't enough to overcome factors like labor costs, automation, and the existence of vast, established industrial ecosystems in other countries. The promise of a manufacturing renaissance driven by tariffs largely remained unfulfilled. So, who were the winners and losers in this trade war maze? Clear losers included American consumers. Paid higher prices for a wide range of goods, from washing machines to electronics and clothing, because companies passed on tariff costs. American businesses, especially those reliant on imported components or those in sectors hit by retaliation, like agriculture, faced increased costs, reduced profits, and significant uncertainty. Many had to spend billions to restructure supply chains. Farmers, particularly soybean, pork, and other agricultural exporters, lost critical markets due to retaliation. Workers, in industries that faced higher input costs or reduced demand due to retaliation. The WTO. The multilateral trading system was weakened as countries resorted to unilateral actions outside of dispute resolution mechanisms. Global economic stability. The trade war contributed to a slowdown in global trade growth and increased geopolitical tension. Were there any winners? Some domestic producers. Industries like steel and aluminum saw domestic prices rise and potentially increase demand, though this was often temporary and came at the expense of downstream industries. Countries that benefited from trade diversion. Nations like Vietnam, Mexico, and others saw increased foreign investment and manufacturing activity as companies sought alternatives to China, but this also brought challenges. Potentially, the US government, in theory, collected billions of dollars in tariff revenue, although many argue this was a transfer of wealth from American businesses and consumers to the government, rather than a net gain for the economy. And it didn't appear to achieve the primary strategic goals. The Phase 1 trade deal, signed in January 2020, paused the escalation but left many tariffs in place. China committed to buying more US goods, particularly agricultural products, and made some concessions on intellectual property protection, but the core issues remained unresolved and the vast majority of tariffs were not removed. Then came the COVID-19 pandemic, which layered another massive disruption onto already fragile, tariff-strained supply chains. The pandemic exposed the vulnerabilities of relying on concentrated manufacturing and accelerated the conversation around supply chain resilience and redundancy, building on the lessons and costs of the trade war diversification efforts. Looking back at the core goals, did the tariffs significantly reduce the trade deficit? While the deficit with China fluctuated, the overall US trade deficit actually increased during the Trump administration. Companies simply shifted sourcing from China to other countries, meaning the goods still came into the US, just from somewhere else. Did it bring back manufacturing jobs at a large scale? Data suggests no significant, sustained boom directly attributable to the tariffs. Did it fundamentally change China's trade practices? While some negotiations occurred, systemic issues like state subsidies and market access remain major points of contention. The trade war, therefore, didn't function as a precise tool to fix specific trade imbalances or bring jobs home. Instead, it acted more like a blunt force trauma to the intricate global trading system. It significantly increased costs for businesses and consumers, disrupted established relationships built over decades, and forced a costly and complex re-engineering of how and where things are made and moved around the world. It created a maze of tariffs, retaliations, and supply chain shifts that ultimately cost billions, primarily paid by American businesses and consumers, without achieving its primary objectives. The legacy of this period is still with us. Supply chains are more diversified, but also often more expensive and less efficient. Trade tensions remain high, not just with China, but as countries grapple with the role of trade in national security and economic competitiveness. The experience highlighted the profound interconnectedness of the global economy and the significant costs and complexities involved when attempting to untangle it using protectionist measures. It serves as a stark reminder that in the intricate dance of global trade, actions intended to protect one part can easily send unpredictable shockwaves through the entire system, leaving everyone navigating a far more complicated and costly maze.